Okay, my name is Michael Casey. I'm originally from Perth, Australia. I am a columnist at the Wall Street Journal these days, covering global finance. I look into the intersection between economics and markets. And I've lived in a bunch of different places around the world, 6 years in Argentina, a couple in Indonesia, so I have a kind of a global take on things, and I like to see things from an international perspective. Well, Argentina, if Bitcoin can't work in Argentina, it may not be able to work anywhere, because it is an absolute test case for it. It's not just about inflation, it's really about power. It's about the notion that an individual can maintain control over their funds. And Argentines for years have reflected a lack of confidence in those that have managed their money for years. I mean, it is a dollarized economy, even if it's not officially so. So much of the Argentine economy is based in dollars because they trust Washington more than they trust Buenos Aires. And so as a result, you're stuck in a vicious cycle in that country. If you can't have your people trust your currency, you really can't manage it. It's ultimately a measure of the degree of trust between the people and the government. As that deteriorates, and it does on a cyclical basis in Argentina, you get inflation, you get rampant currency devaluation problems, and you get ultimately the collapse of your financial system, which we've seen time and time again. So Bitcoin offers an escape route, but it also offers them a tool around the kind of controls that emerge in Argentina as a result of this. The Argentine government traditionally responds to each crisis by slapping capital controls in place, by imposing all sorts of restrictions on people using weapons like tax threats and so forth. Bitcoin removes them from that kind of oversight and control. And there's some very interesting startups that are finding ways in Argentina right now to basically cycle dollars that are coming in through Bitcoin and offering people ways around that. And I think it's no surprise that Bitcoin has such a strong following in that country. The damage that is done to the relationship people have with their money, in my mind, is actually a reflection of the lack of faith in the government, in the entire society itself. So money is the vehicle through which it's manifest, but really what you're seeing when you're seeing a collapse in the currency is a collapse in faith in themselves. So Argentina lacks a covenant. It lacks an agreement between the people and its government. And as a result, it doesn't have a lot of confidence in itself as a society. Money is the vehicle through which we express trust. It is a means through which we recognize our trust in each other's capacity to make good on the debts we have to each other. So when that trust all breaks down, it manifests in this way. So the damage that gets done is extremely profound. It is a deep-seated failure of a society to actually function in a way that allows commerce and allows growth and progress. What you end up with is small circles of trust. So families and friends become the most important way in which you end up doing business and finding ways around the various problems that you face. What you want is to be able to trust everybody. That's a much more constructive way to grow your economy, and you need a vehicle to do that through. The government is the vehicle to do that. The money is the manifestation of it. If Bitcoin reaches the point where it builds a big enough following, then that is exactly what will happen. This idea that faith is shifting from a centralized government body to software, to the mathematics, the algorithm behind it, the idea that you have an irrefutable mathematical law that ultimately makes it impossible for anybody to tamper with it. So as a result, if Bitcoin was to reach that point, I think it would be a manifestation of a greater belief in these laws as opposed to the laws of government per se. There's definitely a demand for people to operate in a trustless context, hence the interest that we see in Bitcoin. I don't know that there's actually deep-seated mistrust in all of our institutions. In certain countries like Argentina, obviously there's an enormous amount of mistrust. I think there's a lot of faith that people still feel in institutions. Whether they should or shouldn't is another question. And to the extent to which that faith gets challenged, as it seriously was in 2008 with the crisis then I think you are seeing people looking for alternative sources of trust. And to the extent to which people start to recognize that you can build systems, you can build algorithmic systems that entrench a mathematical law rather than a law imposed by somebody outside, to the extent that the interest in the knowledge and the understanding of that grows, you will get people, I think, migrating to that understanding of what they can place their trust in. I think the biggest challenge that the world faces is inclusion. I think if we really want to advance the cause of prosperity, and I wholeheartedly believe that every single human being should share that interest in the welfare of all, not just from a moral perspective, but we all gain as a society to the extent to which we broaden the share of prosperity in the world, then financial inclusion is the most important tool that we can get there to. The way in which we move money around, whether it's just in payments or in investments and any other form, it is integral to the economy. You can't have an economy without a payment system. And so where you have huge sectors of the globe who are without access to a bank account, and banks being the primary means by which we actually construct our monetary relationships, you are excluding massive numbers. The numbers are 2.5 billion unbanked, but that just refers to the adult population. So we're talking about maybe 5 billion people when you think about the dependents in those situations. So the majority of the world doesn't have what the rest of us take for granted. And the reasons for that are quite complex, but they come down, in my opinion, to something that is fundamental to the way that Western capitalism has developed, and that is the idea of collateral and how we document that collateral. So we all own our houses, we all own, we own all sorts of things, and in the West we can create title to that, and with that title we can perform commerce, because we can put it up as collateral, we can get mortgages, we can do all sorts of things, and that is a very empowering thing. If you live in an underdeveloped place where there is corruption, there's too much bureaucracy, where there is a failure to actually literally document what you own, you own your place. Everybody recognizes that you own that little house in that shanty town, but you can't prove it. You can't walk into a bank and say, this is mine, and the bank can lend against that. So without that, you can't get a bank account. So there's a deep breakdown in how we actually build those systems in these places. The beauty of something like Bitcoin is that it can bypass all of that in multiple ways. I mean, one is simply that it doesn't need you to prove who you are. You don't have to. You can simply own Bitcoin with nothing more than a cell phone, and with that phone, you can now conduct commerce. You can send money to the other part of the world. You can receive remittance from somebody else in the US. You can start doing business with somebody 200 miles away, which means your source of the yarn or whatever you're using for your textile mill can now be a much broader base than what it is the local guy you have to give money to, and so forth. So it expands things enormously. But on top of that, the blockchain, the idea that you can create irrefutable, tamper-proof documentation of information, opens the door to a more comprehensive documentation of people's ownerships. You can create systems of title now that aren't going to be subject to the corruption of some bureaucrat that might sort of use it as some means to destroy it. The confidence in the documentation itself can be built around the blockchain. So this technology is extremely powerful as a way to bypass the corruption, bureaucracy, and all of the multiple barriers that these people and these underdeveloped places face. These startups that are trying to create an alternative version of government is a fascinating development. I personally don't think that we really should be trying to throw out the existing government. I think governance itself as a means of perpetuating a functioning society will inherently require a very democratic process, and the idea of a leadership centered in some place is important. That said, the idea that we can sort of transfer to the blockchain various aspects of governance is a very exciting idea, that we can build certification, that we can recognize people's rights and entrench those in a way that cannot actually be tampered with by a politician or by some outsider, is a powerful way to sort of I suppose, advance basic human rights. And so in that sense, it's extremely important. And as a check on government, it can be very powerful. So I mean, my vision of how all this thing works out would be to play a very important role in advancing accountability. And that's one of the things I think is most exciting about Bitcoin and the technology behind it, is not so much that it will supplant the dollar or that it will supplant government itself, but that all of a sudden there's a competitor to government, and that government itself now needs to look over its shoulder more than it did. That you can't just get away with things as easily as you did. Now, how it evolves, who knows, because we are at very early days, but the technology and the very principle of what a decentralized system is all about lends itself to this. Voting is another fascinating idea, that we could actually avoid voter fraud by enhancing blockchain-based voting. That people will be able to check how their votes are being counted. That I can now enter into this relationship with my politician with something that I can work with and say, this is my vote, this is how it works. All of that is very exciting, and I think to the degree to which it is merged into and adopted by societies to enhance rather than overthrow existing governments is probably the most valuable way to think about it. We are at very early days in the Bitcoin process right now. The degree of adoption and transactions is tiny compared to, say, what happens on MasterCard and Visa. So to talk about how this might sort of change the nation state and reform the international community and create an international currency and an international form of governments is really pushing this to a much further place than we are right now. Having said all of that, the thought processes that you go through as you start thinking about the decentralization of power that comes with this technology and the value that it brings in terms of wealth creation and prosperity leads to these points. You start to think about, okay, what happens if a country starts to use a cryptocurrency? What if they start issuing a digital dollar? What if there is a digital yuan, a digital Mexican peso? And then all of a sudden money flows much more easily across borders. It's much harder to impose capital controls. You get competition amongst these currencies. If I was to bet, and again, there's a whole range of different scenarios that could come out of this, but I think it's worth imagining that at some point we end up with some form of international governance around what currencies are, that maybe Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency is embraced by an institution like the IMF as the kind of standard, the protocol through which international payments happen, and so that we do away with banking on that international level as it's currently formed in foreign exchange and so forth, and we end up cutting massive costs in trade to the interests of everybody. And ultimately, what governments around that do with their own currencies is an interesting question as well. I do think that there may be a process by which one government, Mexico, has expressed some interest in the idea of a blockchain playing a role in governance. We don't quite know what they mean by that, but this notion that you could require procurement from a federal government, from your representative bodies and agencies and municipalities, so that there's a way to see how money is being spent, is a very powerful way to keep politicians and bureaucrats accountable. So there's a lot that could happen beyond just the idea of an international currency of some sort. The use of this technology to keep people accountable could well, sort of change the structure of government. Whether it leads to international governance, I think, is probably pushing things a bit far. I think the nation state is extremely entrenched, but it's not. It's only been with us for 500 years, sort of interestingly, more or less around the same time that the banking system was created. So if we were to turn all the stuff upside down, who knows? I mean, we're talking about a radical transformation, but there's always the possibility that we end up with a more integrated international community than we have now, precisely because of this technology. The bottom line is that our banking system is way too close to our political system. I think we saw that in the way that 2008 and the crisis transpired. My issue was not that we had to bail out the banks. I think that there was just no choice. We did indeed face something calamitous if we had let the entire financial system unravel. My concern is the way that we bailed them out, and that as a society we did not take over those banks and control them and ultimately kick out the lobbyists, the guys who'd set the rules in the first place, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, the various rules that allowed for a casino-like environment to emerge in Wall Street, and all of the pain that came from that throughout the 2000s. So we let the same guys who set those rules and ultimately through their lobbying efforts in Washington maintain their power. And we let them continue to lobby as we did as we went through a process of regulatory reform. That to me is the ultimate corruption within the system. It's not so much that there are abuses, and there are enormous numbers of abuses, whether it's through money laundering at big international banks, whether it is the distortion of indexes like LIBOR used in interest rate trading, also in foreign exchange. Everywhere we turn we can find scandals, but my biggest concern is the corruption of the relationship between politics and banks in general, and anything that could reassert broad democratic control over our government and remove these money center banks from that process or diminish their power, I just think is an inherently positive thing. There's too many banks in the world to describe it as a cartel per se. I see that as a word that describes a smaller group. But it's definitely not a free market. It is access. It is access driven. If you and the thing to remember as well when we think about what the banking system is, it's very much a bifurcated system where there are big money center, Wall Street, international supermarket banks that do everything and end up being the custodians and the correspondent banks that shift money around the world on behalf of all of us, and the small regional banks, of which there are thousands still in the United States and there are many thousands elsewhere in the world who still play this fundamental role in our societies. Their structure, the way that they operate within the system is very, very different. What is at risk is the concentration of power in that first group, and the degree to which we've separated the interests of society from those banks. The community banks, the regional banks that have felt so hard done by the crisis make a very strong point that they're the ones who are lending, they're the ones who are involved in face-to-face relationships with people, but they can't do anything without the institutional support of the big guys. So to the extent to which those big guys are running the system, there certainly is a problem of collusion, and I mean that in terms of the relationship between the political system and the banks, and there's a problem of just being too big. I mean, the too big to fail concept that emerged out of the crisis has not been resolved at all. If anything, it's gotten worse. There's been greater concentration of banks. The collapse of some of the smaller ones meant that the bigger ones became even bigger. And there are regulations that are helping to contain some of that, capital controls, capital adequacy rules, and others that suggest banks will not have quite the same leverage that they had in the future. But we don't know. We don't know if the next crisis comes whether we're going to face another systemic meltdown because these very, very, very large institutions are just too deeply entrenched in it. Moral hazard is the biggest problem in too big to fail. That concept, of course, refers to the idea that I can take risks because if my bets go wrong, on the other end somebody will pick up the pieces that I leave collapsed on the ground. if you extend that idea into something as big and as powerful as our banking system, the dangers are phenomenal. And again, we saw this most prominently in 2008, where the idea that there is an implicit bailout, that is what the source of the moral hazard is, the fact that I am too big to fail, and so there is no way that a government is going to let my bank go under. I have an asymmetrical risk bias where I can take risks knowing that they're going to come back and bail me up, which is exactly what happened. So it breeds excessive risk-taking. It is, I think, at the heart of a lot of the scandals and the cultural problems that the New York Fed, for example, has been talking about as a fundamental problem on Wall Street. And we see it in trading rooms and behavior, because the incentives are far greater to take those risks and to actually act in illegal and other nefarious manners than there are disincentives to do so. And that asymmetry stems exactly from this problem of too big to fail and the moral hazard that arises from that. It is indeed striking how few people have been prosecuted, few individuals have been prosecuted in the wake of the crisis. And it's a widely held view, and one that I am certainly sympathetic to, that you would change behaviour if there was a greater degree of criminal accountability amongst those in power. So there's great concern that for whatever reason, our judicial system hasn't functioned in a way that would be to the benefits of all of us, and certainly that accountability factor is something that needs to be looked into. I don't think that there's a grand conspiracy as to why people haven't been sent to jail. I don't see it as if there's somebody basically saying let this guy off the hook, let that guy off the hook. I think it's an extremely complex set of rules that have emerged, and they are designed in such a way that we tend to separate the institution from the individual, and we've got an imbalance as well, I think, between the resources and the brain power, to be frank, that is in the hands of the prosecutors and the regulators and is in the hands of the banks. And we know this from the kind of hiring that went on before the crisis. So in that environment, it's just very hard in these very, very complex arenas to debate things like credit default swaps and CDOs and try to ascertain where criminality lies and where it doesn't. The banks just have an upper hand. They really do, in terms of the clout that they can bring to this, and that's just a fundamental problem. I actually don't think that the way to think about this is, should we blame government more or banks more, precisely because of the fact that the institutions have become too dangerously intertwined. We have the laws we have because we have a system that helps to perpetuate those, and it is just a statement of fact that there is way too much money influence from Wall Street in our political system. So, and then ultimately that falls down on us. If the question is, is it government to blame or are we to blame in terms of what we demand of our system, then yes, we are all to blame. I don't think any society is going to get anywhere by just deferring it onto some institution, whether it's our horrible politicians or our big bad bankers. We have the power, and we should be able to exercise that power in changing that. So there's a whole host of reasons for the crisis. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the legal structure that we put in place that perpetuated this. I tend to side more with the notion that this was the excesses of Wall Street more than the excesses of subprime borrowers facilitated by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and so forth. But it's really all part of the same story, and that is that we let an extremely dysfunctional set of rules and financial regulations emerge in such a way that it really was to our absolute detriment. Look, the Wall Street Journal has dedicated quite a bit of coverage to Bitcoin, and I think that's a mark of the fact that we've started to realize this is something big and important. So there certainly is an understanding that this is an important technology. That doesn't mean that everybody in the newsroom is convinced that this is going to be the next big thing, and there's certainly a number of people there who have grave doubts and think that this is just a crazy scheme. I and my co-author Paul Vigna would definitely be seen as outliers and sometimes get mocked for our enthusiasm about this topic. So it's an evolving process. But I do think that, just generally speaking, mainstream press coverage has tended to focus, as it always does, on the scandals and the price movements and so forth. And so, to some extent, and I take some responsibility for this, I suppose, we haven't, I don't think, really delivered a strong enough message about the technology, about decentralization, about the absolutely groundbreaking nature of what blockchain technology is. I think that mainstream press coverage, to some extent, has focused too much on some of the things that naturally press coverage focuses on, the scandals, the rising price, and so forth. And you know, we probably haven't done quite a good enough job to really drill down into the technology itself and what's kind of really exciting and interesting about a decentralized technology like a blockchain. That is probably going to come at some point, let's hope. And to some extent, I think it is to the detriment of the way that the general public sort of perceives Bitcoin, that they've had it sort of filtered through the stories of Silk Road and Mt. Gox and that this sort of dramatic, you know, bubble-like environment for its price. At some point, one would hope that we move from that to sort of really think hard about what this technology really means.
In the fall of 2008, the world financial system nearly fell apart because of the incompetence and instability of the banking system.
With Bitcoin, anyone can send and receive any amount of money anywhere in the world, basically for free. And there's nothing that the big banks or politicians can do to stop it.
At the Money 2020 conference, there was a Bitcoin panel where 4 Bitcoiners were speaking, and behind me were executives and chairmen of the board of several different credit unions. And one turned to the other and said, "These guys don't know the true meaning of evil till we fuck them."
You see, I just want your